The year was 1945. The Pacific War was burning out like a candle exhausted by its own flame. Across the islands, the jungle had gone quiet. Only the buzz of flies and the slow creak of palm leaves in the wind remained where once there had been gunfire. On a humid morning near Leyte, in a makeshift U.S. camp that had once belonged to the Japanese, a column of female prisoners marched under the blinding sun. Their white armbands, crudely fashioned from torn linen, bore faded red circles that had once been proud flags. Now they were only reminders of a fallen empire. Most were nurses, typists, or clerks, faces too young for war but too old for innocence. Their boots, scavenged from dead comrades, sank into the wet clay. They had not bathed properly in months, and the air carried the mix of salt, mildew, and old bandages. A few limped. One coughed until her frame shook, clutching a tin water cup like a relic. Behind them, an American jeep rattled forward, dust rising around the khaki helmets of their guards. Yet there was no cruelty in the men's eyes, only the weary indifference of soldiers who had seen too much. When they reached the camp gate, the women hesitated. A rusted sign still hung there, Imperial Garrison No. 12. The Americans hadn't bothered to take it down. Inside, the old barracks stood half-broken, bamboo walls pocked with bullet holes. Where officers once shouted orders, U.S. soldiers now strung up laundry, shirts, trousers, and flags turned into towels. A record player crackled somewhere, playing a swing tune that sounded impossibly foreign amid the ruins. Lieutenant Mark Avery, a 24-year-old from Kansas who had joined the army after his brother's death at Bataan, leaned on the rail near the gate. He had seen every kind of prisoner, gaunt Japanese soldiers, trembling Filipino civilians, even a captured Korean laborer who'd forgotten his own name. But these women were different. They didn't plead. They didn't speak. Their eyes stayed low, as if to look up would violate some ancient code. One of them, small, with cropped black hair and a face hollowed by hunger, stumbled near the entrance. Avery instinctively stepped forward, catching her arm. She flinched as if struck, then whispered in broken English, "Do not touch." The words weren't defiant. They were terrified. He released her gently. "You're safe here," he said, though even he wasn't sure what safety meant anymore. That afternoon, the camp settled into its strange rhythm. The American cooks dished out rice mixed with tinned meat. The Japanese women sat cross-legged in the dirt, eating in silence. Some soldiers watched, uneasy. For years they'd been told that Japanese soldiers never surrendered, that they'd rather die than be captured. Yet here were women, enemy uniforms frayed, hands trembling as they passed spoons. One private muttered, "Hell, they look like schoolgirls." Another replied, "Yeah, schoolgirls who thought we were monsters." As night fell, the monsoon began, a relentless sheet of rain that soaked every tent and filled the air with the scent of earth. Lightning flashed over the Palm Ridge, illuminating the camp for a heartbeat at a time. In those moments, Avery saw their faces, thin, solemn, eyes reflecting a kind of distant shame. He wondered what they thought of him, an American with a rifle slung over his shoulder, guarding people who no longer had anything left to fight for. By morning, the rain had stopped, leaving shallow pools of muddy water scattered between the barracks. The prisoners moved slowly, cleaning their quarters with what little strength they had. One woman, older than the rest, perhaps in her 30s, found an old broom and began sweeping the floor with quiet determination. Another began patching torn mosquito nets using threads pulled from her own skirt. Watching from a distance, Avery felt something shift inside him. These weren't the fanatics he'd been warned about. They were survivors, clinging to the rituals of order because order was the only thing that kept despair away. Later that week, the camp chaplain arrived to deliver mail and supplies. He asked Avery if the rumors were true, that the women still refused to speak. "Mostly," Avery said. "They think we'll kill them once they're no use." The chaplain nodded gravely. "Can't blame them," he murmured. "They were taught we don't take prisoners. Maybe showing mercy will teach them otherwise." That evening, a faint breeze drifted through the camp, carrying the smell of hibiscus from beyond the wire. The sky turned bronze as the sun sank behind the palms. The women gathered in a line, washing their faces with rainwater collected in old buckets. One laughed softly, just a breath of laughter, almost forgotten, and another quickly shushed her. But Avery heard it. It sounded like something breaking loose after years of being trapped. Not far from the barracks stood a small, rectangular basin, an old officer's swimming pool, cracked and overgrown with vines. The Americans used it for washing boots or cooling beer bottles. But that night, as Avery passed it, he noticed the rain had filled it almost to the brim. The water shimmered under the moonlight, still and inviting. It was the first clean water he'd seen in days that wasn't meant for drinking or scrubbing. For a brief, impulsive moment, he thought of offering it to them, to let them wash properly, to feel human again. Then he dismissed the thought. Orders were orders. Prisoners weren't guests. Still, the idea lingered. When he saw the women the next morning, their faces drawn, their hands raw from washing uniforms and buckets, he couldn't help but glance toward that pool. A symbol of something too normal for war, of life before fear took root. The camp medic, a wiry Texan named Harris, noticed his look. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" he said with a grin. "They ain't gonna believe it if we let him near that thing." Avery didn't answer. But he knew Harris was right. Days passed. The war dragged toward its final breath. Rumors spread. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender. The world beyond the camp was changing, but here time seemed trapped between guilt and duty. The women kept their silence, the soldiers their distance. Yet beneath the stillness, something invisible was building, a quiet tension not of hatred, but of possibility. And then, one afternoon in August, as the tropical heat pressed down like a hand on the world, Lieutenant Avery gave a single ordinary order that would become unforgettable. He pointed toward the pool, its rainwater glinting in the sun, and told his men, "Clean it up." The soldiers stared at him, uncertain. "Sir?" one asked. Avery's voice was calm, almost casual. "They've earned a bath." No one moved for a moment. The air was thick with disbelief. Even the prisoners froze, unsure if they'd heard right. And as the first shovel scraped the bottom of that forgotten pool, the camp began to stir with a kind of wonder none of them could name. It was the beginning of something the war had nearly erased, a small, reckless act of mercy. When the order spread through the camp, it felt unreal. The soldiers carried buckets and shovels to the abandoned pool, scraping moss from its sides and fishing out floating leaves. The air smelled of bleach and wet concrete, sharp enough to sting the nose. Prisoners watched from the barracks, their faces pressed against bamboo slats. None spoke. Even the guards' voices were low, as if afraid to disturb something fragile forming in the air. By noon the water shimmered blue-gray beneath the sun, rippling under the whir of dragonflies. It was only a pool, yet it looked like a portal to another world, one untouched by the stench of war. Lieutenant Avery leaned against a post, cigarette between his fingers, watching the work. He'd told himself it was simple, just hygiene, just decency, but something deeper had moved him to it, something he couldn't name. Maybe it was the sight of the women kneeling by muddy buckets, washing with rags that barely touched the dirt. Maybe it was the way they flinched at laughter, trained to expect mockery. "If kindness is a weapon," he muttered to himself, "then let's see what it can do." By mid-afternoon, Sergeant Harris tossed the final bucket of clean water in and looked up. "Ready, sir." Avery nodded. He approached the barracks where the women sat under the shade, sewing or staring at the ground. Their guard, Private Kelly, hesitated before translating the order in slow Japanese. "The lieutenant says, you may bathe in the pool." The words hung in the air like a strange riddle. The women froze, glancing at one another, unsure if it was a trick. One of them, the same small nurse who had refused his touch days earlier, rose stiffly. Her voice trembled. "For us." Kelly nodded, uncomfortable under her gaze. "Yes. You can swim." The silence stretched. Then another woman whispered something in disbelief, soft laughter tinged with fear. A few pressed their hands together, not in gratitude but in confusion. They had heard stories that Americans humiliated prisoners, that kindness was only prelude to cruelty. The idea of being allowed to swim, to enjoy water freely, was beyond comprehension. Still, they followed when Avery gestured toward the pool. The Americans stepped back, forming a loose perimeter but keeping their rifles slung down. No commands, no shouting. Just a quiet expectancy that felt more sacred than military. The women stood at the edge, staring at the reflection of the sky trembling on the surface. A breeze lifted the smell of soap from a crate nearby, ivory bars the soldiers had gathered from their own rations. The first woman removed her shoes and dipped a toe in. The water was cool, almost tender. She gasped, then laughed nervously, covering her mouth as if she'd committed a sin. The others watched. Another woman followed, wading knee-deep, her skirt clinging to her legs. A murmur rose, part disbelief, part relief. When the nurse finally stepped in, she sank to her knees, cupping water in both hands and splashing her face, the drops tracing paths through dust and salt. Around her, more joined, some weeping silently, others whispering to one another like children rediscovering play. Avery turned away, giving them privacy. He sat on a crate, lighting another cigarette. Harris joined him, smirking. "You realize, Lieutenant, you just staged the strangest peace treaty in the Pacific." Avery exhaled smoke through his nose. "Maybe peace just starts smaller than we think." In the distance, laughter rippled across the camp, real laughter this time. Not derisive, not hysterical. Human. The soldiers glanced over, half smiling, half ashamed, as if they'd glimpsed a piece of innocence they thought the war had buried. One of the prisoners, an older matron with gray at her temples, climbed from the water and bowed deeply toward Avery. Her uniform clung to her thin frame, and her hands trembled as she spoke. "You do not mock?" Her accent was thick, her voice hoarse. Avery shook his head. "No, ma'am. Just swim." She nodded slowly, eyes shining with tears she refused to shed. That moment, awkward, brief, felt like the truest surrender either side had seen. The scene unfolded in quiet rhythm. Splashes, murmurs, the clinking of metal dog tags as soldiers leaned against railings, pretending not to watch. A few offered towels. Others turned away, lost in thought. For years they'd been told these people were fanatics, demons in human form. Now they saw frightened women bathing under the same sun. The realization carried a weight no victory report could measure. When the sun dipped low, the pool glowed amber. The women lingered, tracing ripples with their fingers, as though afraid the spell would break once they stepped out. One by one they returned to the barracks, leaving footprints on the concrete. The air smelled of soap, skin, and salt water, a scent of life after decay. That night, Avery wrote in his field journal by lantern light. "Today, the enemy laughed. I can't tell if it was mercy or madness that made me let them. But for the first time, it felt like the war had an opposite." He closed the notebook, staring at the small pool visible through the tent flap. It shimmered faintly in the moonlight, a silver wound healing in slow motion. Across the compound, the women whispered in low voices. Some spoke of home, others of disbelief. The nurse lay awake, her damp hair spread across a thin blanket. She thought of her brother, killed at sea, and of the promise she'd made to never let an American see her cry. Yet her eyes burned now, not from sorrow but confusion. These men had not mocked, had not struck, had not even stared. They had simply given back something she'd forgotten existed: choice. The following morning, the pool was still. Dragonflies hovered above it, and the soldiers walked by as though guarding a shrine. The women cleaned their quarters with quiet diligence, humming softly, a sound foreign yet familiar. Something intangible had shifted, an invisible ceasefire not written in treaties. Avery watched from the fence line, his boots sinking into the damp earth. Harris joined him, squinting against the light. "Think they'll remember this, sir?" Avery nodded slowly. "Maybe not the faces," he said, "but maybe the feeling." He glanced toward the sky, where clouds gathered like the edges of a curtain waiting to fall. Far beyond the camp, radios crackled with distant news, rumors of surrender, of bombs that ended worlds. But inside this small enclosure, the war had already changed shape. Enemies had shared silence without hate, laughter without victory. The pool, still rippling under the morning breeze, reflected both flags in its surface. Two nations momentarily mirrored, neither winning nor losing. And when the chaplain walked through the gate later that day, bringing the latest report from Tokyo, he found Avery still standing there, eyes fixed on the water. "Lieutenant," he said softly, The war might be over. Avery didn't turn. His voice was quiet, steady. "Not here," he said. "Not yet." The pool shimmered again, catching the sun like a promise half-kept, half-feared, its stillness holding the memory of a peace no one dared name. The laughter that had drifted from the pool did not fade easily. For days, its echo lingered in the camp, soft, uncertain, as though both sides feared acknowledging what had happened. The Japanese women returned to their barracks cleaner, lighter, but wary of their own relief. The Americans, meanwhile, went about their duties with a new, unspoken awkwardness. It was as if they'd glimpsed something forbidden, the fragile humanity of the enemy, and weren't sure whether to feel pride or shame for it. Lieutenant Avery felt the shift most of all. He noticed how the prisoners began walking with straighter backs, how a few dared to look the guards in the eye. They spoke more among themselves now, sharing whispered jokes that even the language barrier couldn't disguise. To his surprise, discipline improved. Fewer arguments broke out. Hunger rations lasted longer. War, he thought, had trained everyone to obey through fear. Yet here, in this small forgotten camp, dignity was proving the stronger leash. The nurse with the cropped hair, the one who'd once recoiled from his touch, became a quiet symbol of this change. She moved with calm precision, tending to the sick and helping others patch uniforms. Once, when a soldier twisted his ankle near the barracks, she approached him with a strip of torn cloth and gestured for him to sit. Avery watched from a distance as she bound the wound expertly, her hands trembling but steady. The soldier muttered thanks, bewildered. When she bowed, he did too. It lasted only seconds, but it was longer than most ceasefires in the Pacific had ever held. Yet beyond the wire, rumors began to seep in like humidity through canvas. The war was ending. Japan was collapsing under fire and flame. Hiroshima, Nagasaki. Words too heavy for comprehension. The women heard fragments from guards' conversations, half-understood English punctuated by gestures of explosions in the air. That night, the barracks fell silent. Even the insects seemed to stop. The nurse whispered a single word, "Kiritai, I want to go home," and no one answered. Home was an idea that no longer existed. Avery walked the perimeter under a full moon, the radio on his belt hissing with static. He thought of his brother again, how he'd died on Bataan, left on some nameless trail under a foreign sun. He had grown up hating the flag that had done it. The empire that taught surrender was sin. Yet tonight, looking at the wire glinting like silver threads in the moonlight, he felt only exhaustion. Maybe hate, like war, was a thing that could starve to death if you simply stopped feeding it. The next morning, the chaplain gathered the soldiers and announced that the emperor had surrendered. A stunned silence followed, then a low murmur. Harris broke it with a half-laugh. "So that's it, huh? After all this?" Avery said nothing. He looked toward the barracks. The women stood in a line, heads bowed, unsure what the news meant for them. Freedom. Punishment. Both seemed equally possible. Orders came quickly. Prepare for repatriation. The camp would soon be dissolved, the prisoners transferred to Manila. Trucks rumbled in, carrying new supplies and unfamiliar officers with clean uniforms and unreadable faces. These men were efficient, distant, and uninterested in the strange rapport that had formed here. They measured, recorded, inventoried. To them, mercy wasn't in the manual. Avery found himself bristling against their tone, the clipped way they spoke to the women through translators. It felt as though a fragile bridge was being torn down plank by plank. That evening, as the sun bled into the sea, one of the new officers scolded a prisoner for speaking out of turn. His voice was sharp, almost cruel in its precision. Avery stepped forward before he could think. "She's not disobeying," he said quietly. "She's asking where her sister's being taken." The officer glanced at him, expression cool. "Your sympathy's showing, Lieutenant." Avery's jaw tightened. "So is your ignorance." For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then the officer turned away, muttering something about fraternization. Avery exhaled slowly, aware that a line had been crossed, and that he didn't care. Later that night, the nurse approached him by the fence, carrying a folded scrap of paper. "Please," she said softly, holding it out. Her English had improved, Her tone was steady. "Give to Red Cross. My family." He nodded, taking the note without opening it. The handwriting was delicate, faint as smoke. She bowed once more, but before turning back, she met his eyes fully for the first time. In that gaze, there was no fear, only acknowledgement, the silent understanding that they had shared something neither could name. Days passed in preparation. Trucks filled with crates. Paperwork piled high. The pool was drained again, left cracked and dry under the sun. Soldiers packed their gear with the mechanical rhythm of men too tired to celebrate. The women sat together, combing their hair, sewing new bands for travel. The air smelled of salt and exhaust. War's ending, Avery thought, didn't sound like victory. It sounded like packing up grief. On the final morning, he stood near the gate as the prisoners lined up to leave. The nurse was near the front, clutching a small satchel. When her turn came, she hesitated, then reached into her sleeve and withdrew a single object, a bar of soap, worn down almost to nothing. She placed it on the table beside him. "For remember," she said simply. Avery swallowed. "I'll remember." She bowed once, then stepped onto the truck. The engine growled, smoke rising like a thin prayer into the humid air. As the convoy rolled out, the camp felt emptier than it had even in battle. Harris walked up beside him. "Guess that's the end of your humanitarian experiment," he said with a half-smile. Avery didn't reply. His eyes were fixed on the wire fence, where a scrap of cloth still fluttered in the wind, a fragment from a prisoner's sleeve, snagged on the barbs. The sun caught it, turning it briefly to gold. He realized then that mercy had its own cost. It left you exposed, unable to return fully to hatred. The nurse's soap still sat on the table, glinting faintly. Avery picked it up, turning it over in his hand. The faint scent of ivory lingered, outlasting uniforms, flags, and orders. For a moment, he imagined her laughter by the water, the ripples breaking like glass under sunlight. Behind him, the camp radio crackled again, a voice reading casualty numbers, surrender terms, occupation schedules. But he barely heard. The barbed wire trembled in the wind, humming faintly, as if the island itself was trying to remember what silence used to sound like. And somewhere far off, maybe imagined, maybe real, came the echo of water splashing, soft and defiant, as though the memory refused to die. The ships waited in Manila Bay like gray ghosts, engines rumbling beneath the dawn haze. The sea was heavy with diesel and memory. On the dock, a line of Japanese prisoners, men, women, nurses, clerks, stood beneath the rising sun, ready for repatriation. They carried nothing but satchels and papers, their eyes fixed on the horizon that would lead them back to a homeland they no longer recognized. Among them stood the nurse with the cropped hair, her face calm yet unreadable. She had not spoken since leaving the camp. Some said she had forgotten how. Others said she was afraid of what her voice might reveal. Lieutenant Avery watched from the pier, his uniform clean for the first time in weeks. His orders were simple: oversee boarding, confirm names, sign off. Yet he felt like a ghost himself, hovering between duty and something far less defined. The war had ended on paper, but its weight remained, heavy, invisible, lodged somewhere behind the ribs. Around him, soldiers laughed too loudly, pretending relief. The chaplain prayed softly beside the transport crates, and gulls circled overhead like restless spirits. Avery's gaze found the nurse as she handed her documents to an officer. For a heartbeat, their eyes met, and the air seemed to pause. He remembered the pool, the laughter, the disbelief, the way sunlight had fractured across the water like a promise trying to hold. It felt impossibly distant now, like a dream glimpsed before waking. He had told himself that kindness meant nothing in the machinery of history, that mercy vanished in the face of orders. Yet every night since, he had dreamt of rippling water and the smell of soap. When the nurse reached the ramp, she turned slightly, her gaze flicking toward him. It wasn't farewell or gratitude, just acknowledgement, quiet and complete. Avery gave a subtle nod. That would have been the end, but fate, as always, refused simplicity. A shout erupted near the back of the line, a commotion. One of the younger Japanese women had collapsed. Heat, exhaustion, fear, no one knew. The guards tensed, unsure whether to approach. The nurse broke from her line before permission could be given. She knelt beside the fallen woman, feeling for a pulse, calling softly in Japanese. The American medic rushed forward, hesitated, and then dropped beside her. The two worked together without words, compressing the chest, cooling her forehead, coaxing breath back into still lungs. The crowd watched in silence, the ocean murmuring against the hulls. Finally, the woman stirred, gasping, her fingers clutching the nurse's sleeve. A ripple of relief passed through the dock. Avery let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The nurse sat back, wiping her forehead, and for a moment their eyes met again. No barriers now, only exhaustion and shared humanity. The medic muttered, "She'll be all right." The nurse nodded faintly. The guards motioned her back into line, but Avery raised a hand. "Let her rest," he said. No one argued. The transports began loading. The sound of boots on metal ramps echoed across the water. As the nurse prepared to board, she turned once more toward Avery and spoke softly, her accent rough but her tone deliberate. "War finish. But memory, no finish." The words struck like a quiet blade, simple and irrevocable. Then she vanished into the crowd, swallowed by uniforms and sunlight. Hours later, as the ships pulled away, Avery stood at the edge of the dock, watching their silhouettes shrink against the horizon. Harris approached, a cigarette dangling from his mouth. "You think they'll remember us kindly?" he asked. Avery didn't answer. He was watching the ripples trailing in the ship's wake, thinking how they looked like the pool's surface on that first day. Disturbed, luminous, fleeting. "Maybe remembering isn't the point," he said finally. "Maybe it's enough that it happened." That night, Manila glowed under blackout lights as the first storm of autumn rolled in. Rain struck the tin roofs in a steady rhythm, drowning out the distant music of victory parades. Avery sat at his small desk, the nurse's soap still wrapped in a handkerchief beside his lamp. He opened his notebook and began to write, not reports, not numbers, but memory. He described the sound of the women's laughter, the smell of hibiscus after rain, the strange ache that came from realizing mercy could feel like defiance. His pen moved slowly, carefully, as though each word might bruise. When he finished, he tore the page free and folded it into an envelope. No address, no stamp. He placed it inside his footlocker with a soap, a private record of the war's quietest battle, the one fought between hatred and decency. Outside, thunder cracked, and he thought of the ships pushing north through rough seas. He wondered if she was awake, if she too could hear the same storm and think of the same water. Weeks later, orders came through, reassignment to Tokyo for post-war duties. Reconstruction, intelligence, translation work, nothing glamorous, but essential. When Avery arrived, the city stunned him. Tokyo was a skeleton of light and smoke. Streets he'd seen in photographs were gone, replaced by ash and silence. Children picked through rubble for scraps of metal. Women washed clothes in ditches filled with rainwater. Yet amid the ruin, he felt something familiar, the rhythm of survival. One morning, while reviewing records at a Red Cross depot, a clerk handed him a bundle of letters for translation. Among them was a note written in careful English, ink faint but steady. "To the American lieutenant who let us swim. We did not forget. When I see water now, I think not of war, but of breath. Tell your men, the pool still lives in us." There was no signature, only a small drawing at the bottom, a single ripple expanding outward. Avery sat motionless for a long time. The noise of the office faded. He could almost smell the bleach again, hear the laughter echoing against palm trees. In the end, he slipped the letter into his jacket pocket and walked outside. The winter air bit at his skin, and the ruins of Tokyo shimmered faintly under the gray sky. In a puddle near the curb, rainwater reflected the broken skyline, trembling with each drop. He stared at it, then smiled, a small, tired smile that carried both sorrow and peace. Behind him, the world moved on, trucks rumbling, soldiers shouting, children playing with sticks in the mud. But for Avery, the war ended right there, in that reflection. Not in surrender documents or parades, but in a shared memory of water, laughter, and fragile grace. He turned toward the harbor, where new ships were already loading supplies for a nation learning to breathe again. Somewhere out there, he thought, The nurse was alive, perhaps walking beside another pool, her reflection breaking in sunlight. And as he walked away, the puddle rippled once more, like the past refusing to vanish, like mercy learning to endure. Which city are you watching our video from? For more powerful stories from World War II, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Thank you.